So moving right along in Spengler's Decline of the West to the third chapter, chapter 3, which is called The Problem of World History, part 1, Physiognomic and Systematic. The physiognomic and the systematic. So what Spengler's going to do right now is to pause for a discussion of method. And he's going to describe how his method, which comes out of the tradition of physiognomy, which is the old precursor to comparative morphology, which is an approach to science that was invented by Goethe and that was also practiced in the early part of the 19th century by people like Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire and Cuvier and so forth, and Richard Owen, is a method that is based originally in physiognomy. You can already see it in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where he describes a character, and if a character has a warped soul, a deformed soul, he'll also have a deformed face. So that the idea of physiognomy was originally the idea that the outer bears the stamp of the inner character. Not much credence is given to it anymore, but this is the type of thing that he opposes to what he calls the systematic approach to nature. And this is the same thing once again as his opposition that we've seen established so far between nature and history. The world as nature, which is a picture of the world as a dead thing, as something become, that is treated using mathematics to create a picture of cause and effect relations. This is the world of the systematist, versus the world as history, which is the world of the physiognomist, which is the world of time and things unfolding in accordance not with causality, but out of inward necessity, out of the destiny idea, the idea of actualizing the possible, the way in which the soul actualizes its potentialities that become actualized in the real world. This is the tension between soul and world that he had already defined in the earlier chapters. So that's nature versus history and the two temperaments. So it's important to understand what he means by these as they reflect themselves in two different types of intellectual temperaments. The physiognomist is a different type of temperament than the systematist, who tends to be rather more rigid and mechanical in his orientation. Newton, for example, or Darwin, let's say Newton in opposition to Goethe. Goethe is the great figure for Spengler, who invented the science of comparative morphology and whose morphological principles Spengler is going to adopt and be the first person who applies them to the study of history, which he now believes can give him a privileged insight into the nature. This is Spengler as a traditional classical metaphysician, a privileged insight into the nature of the essence of historical phenomena based on morphological knowledge. So this is the difference between Plato, let's say, and Aristotle, or between Leonardo da Vinci and Newton, or the difference between Kant and Goethe. The systematizer, the Kant, the Newton, creates a complete system of the world in accordance with the principle of causality, and it's a stiffened world. It's a world of things become, and it's usually a world that is complete. And Spengler basically says that the only way it can be complete is because it's been shorn of time. Time is no longer involved in the creation of this picture, so that the systematist can thereby create a world of immutable laws and paint a vision of the world as though time did not exist within it, and in which its principles and laws were fixed and eternally valid for all time, like Kant's a priori, which is for him eternally and universally valid for all time, or the categories of Aristotle, which are a complete vision of the classical intellect of the time. But for people like of the other type, the Plotinus, the Dante, the Plato, the world is a living thing. It's in a process of becoming. It's changing, growing, it's in flow. This is like Leonardo da Vinci's idea. The world is just all this stuff that's going on and all these different processes and phenomena. The world's alive for Leonardo. It's a living, breathing thing. And whereas the systematist tends to approach the phenomena of the world and creating this, they're both involved, I should point out, in creating a cosmology, a picture of the world as nature. But they're just two different types of approach to erecting a cosmology of the world as nature. And the systematist tends to make use of mathematics and conceptual discourse, whereas the physiognomist tends to make use of images, myths, symbols, tends to think in terms of pictures, And it's basically the same thing as the artistic temperament. It's a temperament that's much closer to the arts, and the physiognomist has a tendency to see the world in terms of pictures and images rather than in terms of abstract concepts, systems, and ideas. But it's not a complete opposition. There are, of course, systematists like Hegel who also have imaginary pictorial ideas in their language. A lot of the German philosophers who are systematists, like Kant and Hegel, also have this visionary dimension in their thinking. So it's not just a complete cut and dried thing. But Spengler wants to make sure that we understand that these are two different types of intellect here, and that he clearly sees himself on the side of the physiognomist. And that he doesn't believe that any historian hitherto has applied the principles of comparative morphology of physiognomy basically to history. So he's going to be the first to do this, and he wants you to know that. So this is also the opposition between form and law, Gestalt and Gesetz. Form and law, form morphology, Goethe coined the term, means the study of form, the study of forms. But forms without reference to causality. Goethe's whole world picture, which I want to spend a moment going into here, since Spengler presupposes its whole methodology, is based on a non-causal understanding of how forms evolve in nature. Formation, transformation, as Goethe puts it, the eternal mind's eternal recreation. That's Goethe's whole approach there in a nutshell. And so, since he depends so much on Goethe, I want to pause just for a second to discuss what we mean by comparative morphology, or what Goethe meant. Goethe's picture of the scientific world is a picture of the world as something that's alive and changing and becoming. If we look at his theory of plant metamorphosis, he came up with a theory of plant metamorphosis that is eminently morphological. It conceives the plant, any plant, the archetypal plant. This is the sort of, what Goethe did was to study what he called the Urphänomen, the prime phenomena that are incarnate in the processes of nature. It's a little bit like Deleuze's ideas in difference in repetition, that all the processes of nature are incarnations of ideas that are realizing themselves, actualizing themselves, from the virtual to the extensive. There's a touch of Goethe in Deleuze, actually. And so the prime phenomenon, for example, he develops a color theory, the Farbenlehre, the color theory that he rejects Newton's theory of color as oscillations of wavelengths, gets rid of it and says no, color is based on the prime phenomenon of the opposition of light and darkness, and opacity versus transparency. And this prime phenomenon can be used to understand the generation of the basic colors. And for him, the four basic colors are yellow and blue, which are the exact opposites of each other, and red and green. And he figured this out, for example, if you stare at a red patch for long enough and then turn your eyes to a white wall, you'll see green, because the eye spontaneously produces the opposite color to compensate. So he figured this color theory out, and that's an example of an approach to color that's kind of an artist's approach, but it's not what typically we would regard as a valid scientific approach. He developed a theory of the metamorphosis of insects. He developed a theory of meteorology, a geological theory, and also a theory of vertebrate, the vertebrate theory, in which he imagined all vertebrates being essentially one animal, the same organism, since all the bones in the skull, for example, are the same in the human skull and in the skull of a fish and in the skull of any vertebrate whatsoever. They all have the exact same number of bones. But in Goethe's day, the intermaxillary bone was something that had not been discovered in the human skull and was thought not to be there, and its absence was held to be proof of the fact that the human being was separate from the rest of nature. But Goethe, using his morphological method, realized that it must be there, if he was right about morphology, about this vertebrate type, and did indeed find it as a result. And so he's credited with the finding of the intermaxillary bone in the human skull. So vertebrates have all the same number of bones. So it's as though vertebrates were simply a single animal, a primordial animal, whose organs are transformed differently as a result of the relationship of this animal to its milieu, to its environment. Different aspects of the environment call forth different organs to be transformed and changed in different ways. And so for example along the lines of this, we can say then that in vertebrates, the arm of a human being, the forelegs of a horse, the wings of a bat, the pectoral fins of a fish, these are all homologous organs. In other words, they're the same. So Goethe has this distinction, and it's an important one to understand, between homology and analogy. These are homologous. Homology is just a special type of analogy in which what is similar is that they're formally they're the same. They're all the same organ. For example, the swim bladder of a fish is morphologically homologous to the lungs of a man. They're the same organ. However, the gills of the fish are analogous, not homologous to the lungs. They perform the same function. It's a different function than the swim bladder. But the swim bladder is actually the same organ adapted to a different environment. The gills perform a different function. So we have this distinction between form and function in this kind of biology, and it was a distinction invented by Goethe that carried through much of 19th century zoology. And so it's important to understand this, because Spengler is going to apply this method to the study of civilizations. And then so Goethe's theory of plants is, he developed this theory of the plant, in which every aspect of a plant is a transformation of one idea, the idea of leaf. So when we look at a plant, when we look at the inside of an orange, what we've got are transformed leaves, basically. Every single part of the plant is leaf. It might be a compressed leaf or a primitive leaf. There's a basic opposition between root and leaf. The root goes down, Goethe says, into darkness, and it doesn't develop. The leaf goes up into the light, but it develops into a very complex and refined organism. And the plant is also characterized, in addition to this prime phenomenon in which every aspect of it is a transformed leaf, it's also characterized by two different tendencies: a vertical growth that pushes the plant up, which is tempered by a spiral growth. And Rudolf Steiner will say, the great German mystic Rudolf Steiner will say that this spiral growth that plants have is an earthly imitation of the orbits of the planets. That's some sort of mystical idea. Goethe didn't have that idea, but a lot of Rudolf Steiner does depend also. He depends for a lot of his ontology on Goethe's morphology, just as Spengler does. Both Spengler and Steiner, who were contemporaries, were coming out of the same intellectual background here, a love of Goethe and Nietzsche and so forth, German philosophy. So then the other aspects of the plant is that the plant goes through a series of definite stages, 5 or 6 of them, in which its growth is characterized by a contraction and expansion process. The seed is the plant in its most contracted state. When it shoots out the first stem leaves, then it begins the process of expansion. Then as it forms the corolla, a contraction principle, it reverts back to contraction. Then as it produces the flower, we have another expansion. And then as it produces the stamens and corolla as the sex organs, we have another contraction, and then a final expansion with the production of the fruit, whatever the fruit happens to be. And so we have these alternating stages of contraction, expansion. We have the vertical growth tempered with the spiral growth, the opposition of root and leaf, and also the idea, and this is another idea that Steiner takes from Goethe, that the juices of the plant, as they are taken up by these ever more and more delicate organs, become more and more refined and etherealized until we have the production of these beautiful, splendid flowers that are the result of this sort of spiritual refinement of these juices that ascend up through the plant. And so this is Goethe's way of approach of nature, and it has nothing to do with causality. Never is there a word, as Spengler says, not a breath of causality. There is no cause for any of this. It just happens. It's a morphological process of arising and unfolding in accordance with Platonic ideas that are embedded and immanent in the physical world. So nothing mechanistic whatsoever. And so Spengler wants to apply these principles to a study of history.